All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get this day underway. My name is Will Inboden. I'm a professor at the LBJ School, the Courtesy Appointment and History Department. I'm also the executive director of the Clements Center for National Security, and we are honored to be your host today. The origins of this workshop really are with the Harrington Fellowship. Many of you may be familiar, a wonderful program that has supported bringing top-notch PhD students to UT and top-notch visiting scholars. And in that respect, the Clements Center has been honored to host a Harrington Faculty Fellow this year, Dr. Charlie Laderman, who really is the intellectual architect of this program. Charlie is recently a faculty member at Cambridge and is in just a few weeks joining the faculty of King's College London, the War Studies Department there. So we've been very honored to have Charlie with us here for the year. As you'll hear when he comes up to speak, he's not from around these parts, but those of you in the back might not be able to appreciate this, but when Charlie comes up to speak, he will be proudly showing off his new Lucchese boots, which he's not really speaking, so I'm wearing mine today as well. So anyway, so he has gone native in the best sense of the term. One reason I'm especially excited about the topic of inquiry today on conservative internationalism is it's one of those themes that brings together historians and political scientists from different vantage points. So it's a staple of international relations, that there are three main schools of theoretical thought on how the international system works. Of course, realism, constructivism, and liberal internationalism. And yet one of our questions today is there a fourth? Is there conservative internationalism? And we're going to be very honored to hear from basically the godfather, or even the grandfather of that school of thought, Henry Now, who I'll be introducing momentarily, who literally wrote the book defining and contending for conservative internationalism. That's why we're also honored to have a number of political scientists among our speakers today who will be bringing that disciplinary perspective. But this is also of interest to historians, particularly with the focus on different American presidents. And one thing that we historians are endlessly debating is how do we conceptualize and categorize different American presidents? How do we understand their approaches to foreign policy, to diplomacy, to national security questions? Who is more like whom? Who is more of an influence on whom? How do we categorize them? Liberal, moderate, conservative, internationalist, isolationist, things like that. And so you're also going to be hearing from a number of historians today with our perspectives on which U.S. presidents, if any, can appropriately be termed a conservative internationalist. What did they do to develop that school of thought and to implement it, and how does it continue with us today? So starting us off is going to be our featured plenary keynote address from Professor Now, and then chairing his session and commenting and taking questions from the audience will be Professor Josh Busby. You can find their full bios in the conference materials, but I'll just mention that Henry is really one of the most eminent scholars in the academy in the country today. He's a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University, where he's taught for many years. He's the author of several books, and of which we are featuring back there at the back. But he's also I guess we could say, Henry, a recovering practitioner, right? So having spent some time as a senior State Department official in the Ford administration, and then an official in the Reagan National Security Council staff. So he's got some of the first-hand exposure from that. And then my colleague and friend from here closer to home at the LBJ School, Josh Busby, will be chairing the session. Again, Josh is also a distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center, a fellow with the RGK Center, and is also an accomplished author and scholar, including doing some very interesting work for the Texas National Security Network on surveying public and elite opinion attitudes on international policy and national security questions. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Henry to get things underway here, and we're looking forward to a full and stimulating day of presentations and discussions. So please join me in welcoming these guys.
Thank you very, very much, Will. Actually, Clements Center is becoming my favorite place in the country. I was down here for a wonderful conference in January on Ronald Reagan, and now a conference on conservatives. Wow. I mean, I've been in the business for 40 years, and I haven't attended many conferences either on Reagan or on conservatives. I can't quite get my dress straight when I come to Texas. I unfortunately don't have the boots yet. But last time I was on a panel when I was here in January, and I was the only one not wearing a tie. So this morning I determined I would put a tie on, but then having walked over here and sweat a little bit, I decided to take the coat off. In any case, let me jump right in and try to stick close to my remarks so that I don't, like most professors, talk too much, or like Dwight Eisenhower once characterized professors as, oh, those are the people who use a lot of big words and take a long time to tell you more than they know. Kind of a devastating commentary on the profession. Look, as I see it, I mean, for the most of the day, we're going to be talking about presidents and the world. And what I'd like to do is just talk about a conservative internationalist tradition in the world. Now, a discussion of traditions and presidents overlap in large measure. Republican presidents, and let's stretch it for a moment, including Trump, are generally regarded as conservatives. But in foreign policy, Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, and George H.W. Bush are generally thought of as following in the realist tradition. George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan in a so-called neoconservative tradition. And Trump, perhaps, in a nationalist tradition. Democratic presidents have normally, starting with FDR, have normally been thought to fall into the tradition of liberal internationalism. Now note immediately that there is no conservative internationalist tradition. Neoconservatism is a latecomer, and there is no broad literature to define it, as there is for nationalism, realism, and liberal internationalism. So for 40 years, I pondered why this was so, and finally in this most recent book, decided to try to fill the gap. So what do I mean by conservative internationalism or fighting for freedom conservatively? I'll first identify a few principal differences between conservative internationalism and the other traditions, explain in more detail what conservative means and the differences it makes for foreign policy, and finally address a couple of the obvious criticisms of conservative internationalism. What are the principal differences? First, by conservative, I mean an approach to foreign policy that favors limited central government and robust civil society. That's the essence of conservative philosophy. Conservatives prefer decentralized public institutions and volunteer competitive private institutions, such as markets, churches, and the like. They believe democracy starts with individuals, not communities. Thomas Jefferson made that point very, very explicitly and memorably, I think, in his first inaugural address, when he said, quote, "Some say that man is capable of governing himself. Some say man is incapable of governing himself. How then is he capable of governing others?" Well, there's an awful lot in that statement, and it suggests that self-government starts with the individual, starts at the bottom, not at the top. Now, in foreign policy, that means that conservatives do not put much emphasis or stock in universal international institutions or bureaucratic expertise any more than they do in domestic affairs. It is not Wilsonian or liberal internationalism, the League of Nations and the United Nations. The conservative vision is more like Jefferson's idea of sister republics, self-governing republics living side by side with similar laws. Nations remain separate and sovereign, especially when it comes to defense, but they share republican virtues of individualism and markets that permit them to enjoy what today we call the democratic peace. Second, conservative internationalism is internationalist. Now, by internationalist, I mean it believes that national security is not primarily about territorial defense and geopolitical balances, as realists and nationalists would certainly argue. It is also about the kind of political and ideological world in which defense is being carried out. Defending America is much easier in a world in which democracies proliferate than in one in which authoritarian powers prosper. Consider how much more difficult American defense would be today if the United States confronted a world like the one in 1914 or 1940 rather than the one that exists today. In short, regime type matters for national security. As my colleague Mike Barnett once put it, quote, "It is much easier to defend America in a world of Mahatma Gandhis than in a world of Kim Jong-uns," end quote. So to begin with, fighting for freedom means increasing incrementally the number of democratic regimes in the world that champion individual freedom and live together under limited government. On the desirability of regime change, internationalists both conservative and liberal part company with realists and nationalists. And on the limited role of international institutions, conservative internationalism parts company with liberal internationalism. Now, what do I mean by conservative? There are many ways to differentiate conservatives from liberals, and most of them are politically charged. Some, in fact, are downright partisan. To me, the fairest way to start is with the proposition that both conservatives and liberals care about the American experiment. That is, they all support the quest for liberty and equality, for freedom and justice. As Lewis Hartz wrote in The Liberal Tradition in America, all Americans are liberals. He meant classical liberals. That is, they advocate individual liberty, as laid out in the Declaration, and Republican institutions as provided by the checks and balances of the Constitution. There are no pre-Enlightenment conservatives in America who believe in authoritarianism, aristocracy or class, and clericalism. For that reason, America, unlike Europe, has never had a significant fascist, communist, or even confessional, that is, religious party. Where American conservatives and liberals differ, however, is on the priority they give to liberty versus equality, the priority between liberty and equality. When there is a trade-off, liberals are more willing to accept restraints on liberty to achieve greater equality. Conservatives are more willing to accept greater inequality to preserve more freedom. Both views are justified and necessary because, as Aristotle told us long ago, there are two types of inequality. One, when equal people are treated unequally, that's the liberal concern. And two, when unequal people are treated equally, that's the conservative concern. So logically, conservatives see the greatest threats to liberty coming primarily from centralized institutions that treat unequal people equally and prescribe one-size-fits-all solutions that restrict choice. They worry about the executive or administrative state, that is, unaccountable bureaucrats, experts, and judges, and prefer to leave most decisions to local and civil society institutions where equal opportunity does not preclude natural inequalities based on differences in ambition, effort, and talent. Liberals, on the other hand, see the greatest threats to liberty coming primarily from the private sector that treats equal people unequally and restricts opportunity, poverty, racial discrimination, corporate monopolies, and the like. They favor an activist state that regulates the private sector and redistributes resources, ensuring greater justice in outcomes as well as opportunity. Now, these differences have been around since the beginning of the Republic. Hamilton and Jefferson fought over the question of the powers of the central government from the beginning of the Republic. And in my judgment, both are necessary for the healthy Republic and for a good America. Now, these domestic differences are important because they lead to significant differences in foreign policy. First, liberals and conservatives differ on how to reform the international system. Liberal internationalism believes that persistent diplomacy in international institutions will eventually temper and narrow differences between authoritarian and democratic regimes. It is willing to concede equality to authoritarian states in international institutions in order to pull them toward liberty. The idea, as John Eikenberry writes, and I quote, is to capture authoritarian states in an iron cage of multilateral rules, standards, safeguards, and dispute resolution procedures, and eventually to domesticate and indeed democratize their politics, end quote. What is needed in this process, according to liberal internationalists, is time, patience, and the realization that history is on freedom's side. Now, conservative internationalists believe that ideological differences may be too great to allow diplomatic outcomes that favor freedom. Treating authoritarian states equally in international institutions may only legitimate those regimes and lead to outcomes that endanger liberty. Secretary of State James Burns warned President Truman already in December 1945 that ideological differences with the Soviet Union made UN agreements unlikely and potentially threatening to freedom in Europe. Truman recognized fairly quickly that these differences would have to be litigated through a competition between two ways of life. That was the vision he laid out in the Truman Doctrine. Now, a second difference follows. Conservative internationalism expects that in this ideological competition, the role of force is going to be more important than liberal internationalism assumes. The reason is that authoritarian states use force more readily at home and are more likely than democratic states to use it abroad as well. In short, authoritarian states can be expected to use force while they negotiate. Thus, according to conservative internationalism, negotiations with authoritarian states require that democratic states arm their diplomacy, the subtitle of my book. The purpose is not to scuttle negotiations, but to counter uses of force by authoritarian states outside negotiations in order to get them to take seriously the discussions inside the negotiations. Now, by contrast, liberal internationalists generally seek to avoid the use of force during diplomacy, regarding it as a last resort to be deployed only after diplomacy and economic sanctions have failed. And then, for some liberal internationalists, only with multilateral consent. Now, let me be clear what I mean by force in negotiations or armed diplomacy. I'm talking about three types of military leverage that can be used in negotiations that go beyond economic sanctions but stop short of military intervention. First, buildup of defense capabilities. How do presidents relate to their military establishments? Secondly, movement or deployment of forces short of actually using them. Stationing of US forces in Europe, for example, after World War II. And thirdly, trade-off of military capabilities at the negotiating table. US INF weapons for Soviet SS-20s. Conservative internationalism is more inclined to use this type of leverage early in negotiations to avoid having to use greater force later when negotiations fail, or if negotiations fail. Liberal internationalism is reluctant to use such leverage during negotiations for fear that it makes negotiations more difficult and creates a slippery slope that guarantees the use of greater force later. Now, both arguments are logical, and the slippery slope is a real issue. It exposes conservative internationalism to overreach and liberal internationalism to appeasement. Thus, as a third difference with liberal internationalism and also with some neoconservatives, conservative internationalism sets harsh priorities to discipline the use of this military leverage. Unlike some versions of liberal internationalism and neoconservatism, conservative internationalism does not seek to end tyranny in every nation and culture in our time. Rather, it cares about the plight of freedom more on the major borders of existing free countries than in remote regions where few democracies exist. This means a greater concern for freedom on the major frontiers of freedom, namely on the borders between Europe's free nations and Russia, and between Asia's free nations and China. Today, the ideological hotspots on these borders are Ukraine and Korea. In these spots, conservative internationalism would argue that the United States should fight for freedom, should hold out for democracy over the long haul, as it did during the Cold War. This is both necessary and possible. Necessary because the consequences of losing freedom on these borders are greater than if we lose it in remote regions, Ukraine versus Iraq, for example. Think of the consequences for freedom already in Europe as a result of Russia's interventions in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. And it is possible to defend and expand democracy on this border because the costs of fighting freedom on these borders are less, given the strong nearby presence of democratic alliances and capitalist markets. Now, in remote regions, such as the Middle East and Southwest Asia, conservative internationalism would recommend that the United States downplay democracy promotion as a matter of priority, not because these countries aren't capable of democracy, but simply as a matter of priorities when you are using force to promote the expansion of democracy. Conservative internationalism would recommend that we deal with threats in these regions, such as the Taliban and ISIS, but except for training and advice, we do not station large forces or expend massive sums of money in these regions to transplant democracy. Above all, we do nothing in these regions to weaken democracies that already exist there. Israel in the Middle East, India, for example, in South Asia. Finally, as a fourth difference with the other traditions, conservative internationalism uses military leverage to achieve compromises that incrementally favor freedom. Now, this is an important difference with realists who seek compromise, to be sure, but only to preserve the status quo or to achieve peace. And it's an important difference with some neoconservatives who seek total victory and no compromise at all. In short, while conservative internationalism arms diplomacy with force, it also never uses force without follow-up diplomacy. That is, without simultaneously offering a compromise or diplomatic off-ramp for adversaries that move the needle toward freedom. Now, a key element of this strategy is to cash in military gains for compromises at the moment when those gains are most significant. James K. Polk was a master at this. I won't go into it because the details are multiple and very interesting, but there's a chapter in my book on Polk. But two recent examples, George H.W. Bush, for example, I think very successfully used the military leverage gained in the First Persian Gulf War to launch a major diplomatic initiative, the Madrid Peace Conference, which eventually indirectly led to the Oslo Accords. Now, his son, George W. Bush, I think, may have missed similar opportunities to leverage military success in the Second Persian Gulf War. He did not take up the Iranian offer in 2003 to negotiate their nuclear program. How serious that was, I don't want to get into that, but we didn't make much of an effort to investigate it. And secondly, he didn't launch a Middle East peace initiative until 4 years later, after his military leverage had waned. And in fact, he had to introduce another surge in order to contain the threat that had emerged in Iraq. How do we know when a compromise favors freedom or the status quo? This is a difficult issue, and it's one I think we need to examine in every case that we're looking at. But let me give you just a quick example from the situation today in Ukraine. A conservative internationalist compromise in Ukraine, for example, would uphold the right of the Ukrainian people someday to choose between a free West and an authoritarian East, just as the West upheld that right for a divided Germany during the Cold War. A realist compromise would call for a buffer state, a Ukraine that is neither East nor West, but neutral. Not surprisingly, Henry Kissinger and other realists, Steve Walt, etc., that's exactly what they have advocated in the case of Ukraine. So here is a difference. Both realists and conservative internationalists treat or are interested in compromise, but they're interested in compromise towards different ends. And only, I think, in the case of the conservative internationalist approach do you push incrementally forward the frontier. You defend and push forward that frontier for you. Now, a few words about the obvious criticisms of conservative internationalism. Is regime type really all that important as a causal factor in world affairs? I conclude it is, and it is at least as important as power and institutions. Realism privileges power. Liberal internationalism privileges institutions. Conservative internationalism privileges ideas or identities or ideologies as the primary causal factors making things happen. Now, we have plenty of scholarship, seems to me, that tells us that regime type matters. We have the democratic peace literature that 4 decades ago established this fact, and that proposition, by the way, that democracies live together in peace, more so than democracies versus non-democracies, that evidence holds up today after much scrutiny. More recently, John Owens, for example, a colleague at the University of Virginia, contributed a magisterial study of the clash of ideas in world politics, the title of his Princeton book from 2010, showing from over 500 years of evidence that ideas, especially differences between countries in regime types, culture, religion, politics, political ideologies, account for military actions as often as relative power or institutional misunderstandings. Mark Haas, in another path-breaking study, young political scientist at Duquesne University, called The Ideological Origins of Great Power Politics, 1789 to 1989, a Cornell book, 2005, reinterprets 200 years of realist history to show that ideological orientations and what Haas calls ideological distance between countries explain outcomes as often as relative power. Those books, by the way, I would highly recommend in any course on theories of international relations. Their argument is not that power and diplomacy do not matter. It is rather that ideas or regime types may at times be the primary cause of shifts in military capability or in institutional understanding, in institutional behavior. The United States and Germany surged to power in the last half of the 19th century, and the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s, I think one could argue, on the strength of resurgent identities. So conservative internationalism tries to fill a gap in the debate among the traditions. It causally privileges regime type to compete with the causal focus of realism on power and liberal internationalism on institutions. But look, thinking about regime change can be heady. All right, how does one do this conservatively? This is usually a point at which my conservative colleagues say, Henry, what's conservative about spreading democracy? All right, I think you can think about spreading democracy conservatively. And to do so, you need to take sort of 3 steps. First, if you're a conservative, you think about freedom largely in terms of individuals, all right, just like Jefferson did. You're starting with individuals all over the world. All right, those individuals are equally worthy. Every individual is equally worthy all over the world and should be therefore the focus of our attention. Second, the idea is to unleash the potential of that individual in all ways, and especially in terms of self-government, by whatever institutions are appropriate in that particular culture or in that particular society. So you acknowledge the fact that democracy is local and that it needs to be inspired and not engineered from outside. The only real universal requirement for democracy is that an opposition exists that offers a meaningful choice to individuals and rotates periodically in power. That's the most important, seems to me, feature of democracy. Now, this may be done through different institutions and different cultures, and history has given us plenty of examples. The spectrum of party politics in Japan, for example, is probably to the right of that spectrum in the United States. And that spectrum in Sweden is probably to the left of the one in the United States. But they are all democracies. So you allow countries to develop their own ways of unleashing the potential of their individuals. But it is important that those individuals have an option, have a choice. And that choice is provided ultimately by the existence of multiple parties, at least 2 parties that operate in opposition to one another. So from a conservative point of view, freedom abroad is not necessarily a specific set of institutions, and it's not certainly American institutions. Yet America still plays a special role in the struggle for freedom from a conservative perspective. It is exceptional. Now, Bill Brandt is going to talk to us a little bit more about that at noontime. But in my view, it is exceptional for this reason. America was the first large country to attempt republican self-government without the authoritarian institutions of a monarchy or state church. Think about it. All the other countries that had attempted this before 1787 were monarchies. I'm thinking of Britain, Holland, there are other examples. This had never been tried before. To create a self-governing system based on individuals acquiring the capability to participate in their own self-government, never been tried before. It was a massive leap in the dark. And it ended up very badly in many countries. Think of the French Revolution. But it succeeded in America, even through the trials of the Civil War. Through the 19th century, America gave the vote to more white male citizens than any other country in the world. Right? And women and minorities didn't have voting rights in any country in the world. So the fight for freedom was in the white community. That is, to give more white people the opportunity to participate in self-government. And in the 20th century, of course, the United States played 3 times the crucial role in defeating authoritarianism around the world. Now, this was the point, I think, on which Reagan, by the way, sort of in my view, personified this sort of way of understanding how you spread freedom conservatively. And he certainly took seriously the issue of struggling for freedom. That is, the need for America to lead it. I mean, he did that, obviously, in the contest with the Soviet Union, in the Cold War, and he did it all very intentionally. You know, in the spring of 1988, just before he went to Moscow, he said the following, quote, "We spoke plainly and bluntly. We said freedom was better than totalitarianism. We said communism was bad. Experts said this kind of candor was dangerous. But far to the contrary, this candor made clear to the Soviets that the differences that separated us and the Soviets were deeper and wider than just missile counts and number of warheads, end quote. Now, he went on to say that the Cold War would be resolved not by arms, all right, but ultimately by a competition of wills, a competition of spirits. So you can think about regime change, I think, conservatively. You can stay true to the cause of expanding, defending, expanding that border of freedom, especially in Europe and Asia, without impinging or imposing democracy on other countries. Lastly, what about armed diplomacy? Isn't that pretty dangerous and maybe even counterproductive? How can you build trust in negotiations by threatening with arms? Look, it's often a very close call as to how and when you use arms in your diplomacy. But the choice is often not diplomacy without arms, it's diplomacy without arms for only one side. Now, Ronald Reagan understood that when he called détente a one-way street. The Soviet Union had already used force in the arms control negotiations to deploy intermediate-range missiles, SS-20s, in Eastern Europe in the late 1970s. Reagan reasoned that the Soviet Union had no incentive to reduce these weapons until NATO deployed its own INF weapons. Thus, Reagan told an NSC meeting in February of 1983, this is 10 months before the deployment of the INF weapons, that, quote, the date to start serious negotiations with the Soviet Union about these arms is when we deploy, close quotes. That date, of course, arrived in 1984 after the missiles were deployed in late 1983 and Reagan was reelected. The Soviets came back to the arms control negotiating table, and this time they came back with a more cooperative partner. Liberal internationalists, on the other hand, tend to think this kind of use of force during negotiations is not supportive of serious negotiations, but only increases distrust and makes agreements more difficult. Jonah Goldberg records Obama's thinking on these matters in the case of Syria. In his interview with the president in The Atlantic, this is April of 2016, Goldberg writes, and I quote, on several occasions over the past year, John Kerry asked Obama to launch missiles at specific targets in Syria, to send a message to the Assad regime. The goal, Kerry told the president, is not to overthrow Assad, but to encourage him and Iran and Russia to negotiate peace. Now, if the objective was not to overthrow Assad, but simply to negotiate peace, Kerry's advice was realist. On the other hand, if the president himself had said, and he indeed did say, that the objective was to get rid of Assad, then the advice was actually consistent with conservative internationalism. Use your military leverage, in other words, to secure compromises that incrementally weaken authoritarian states and strengthen democratic ones. In all of these cases, however, as Goldberg writes, quote, Obama steadfastly refused Kerry's requests, end quote. Obama's approach was classical liberal internationalist. He followed the same approach in Iran. The objective was to build trust, avoid the use of force during negotiations, even if the other side uses force, and get an agreement. That agreement would then serve as a mechanism to restrain the use of force by the other side. Obama made this point explicit. He said, and I quote, it sets the stage, talking about the agreement, to incentivize them, the Iranians, to behave differently in the region, to be less aggressive, less hostile, more cooperative, to operate the way we expect nations in the international community to behave, end quote. So we'll see if that happens. Obama has taken ownership of this. He says, if they have nuclear weapons in 10 years, I own it. Now, these are logically equally logical ways, it seems to me, to think about the use and non-use of force. So I'm not trying to say that there aren't many occasions when liberal internationalism might apply, other cases where the conservative approach might apply. I'm making a case, by the way, here and in the book for all of these traditions, and that they be represented clearly and forcefully in all debates and in all decisions, because that's the only way I think we can make the best decision in that particular case. So, to wrap up, it didn't do too badly, a little over, but let me summarize what fighting for freedom conservatively means. It means first upholding the importance of regime type, and not just territorial defense and national security policy. It means recognizing the need to use force during negotiations to get authoritarian states to take negotiations seriously. 3, it means never use force without accompanying diplomatic objectives. 4, it means use any leverage gained to secure, use any military leverage gained to secure compromises that weaken or at least do not legitimate authoritarian states. And finally, it aims for a world of sister republics that remain separate and sovereign, but share republican or democratic values and live together in what we call the democratic peace. In the end, conservative internationalism embraces the goals of liberal internationalism, namely reforming the international system, going beyond anarchy, the means of realism, namely the use of military force and military leverage in negotiations, not as a last resort, and the purpose of nationalism, namely a world of sovereign nations, not a world of centralized international institutions. Good. I will close there, if I haven't put too many people to sleep, and take your questions.
So I think we have about 20 plus minutes or so until 9:30. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question. And so I'd like to press you to expand on what makes your argument conservative. I kind of feel like both halves of your definition sit a little bit uneasily together. The conservative emphasis on limited government and the internationalist emphasis on liberty and regime type. And it seems to me that the imperatives of defending liberty in areas close to the kind of established liberal realm could lead to or may require more far-reaching policies of nation-building, occupation, alliances, and multilateralism that hollows out the conservative piece of your argument that is the emphasis on limited government. And I'd also like to propose that there could be an alternative notion of conservatism or of conservative internationalism that we might want to countenance that could kind of throw a little bit of a spanner into the works of thinking about it. Are there alternative ways of thinking about this? So, as I've written in my work with John Monton, I feel like the liberal internationalism is something of a misnomer. It's actually establishment internationalism that really reflects the kind of tradition since the end of the Second World War. And establishment internationalism was actually kind of a coalition between sort of internationalists who believed and supported sort of arrows and olive branches in your parlance of force and diplomacy, and then the kind of classic Eugene Witkoff framework of accommodationists, sort of those on the left who only supported sort of the olive branches for the diplomatic means. And so there already exists a tradition in what we think of liberal internationalism, or what I call establishment internationalism, that is distinctly conservative, that believed in both force and diplomacy, but was agnostic about means. And so that you place major emphasis on conservatism as being sort of worried about multilateralism. And in my view, the kind of historic conservative internationalist approach was agnostic about multilateral means. If it suited U.S. national interests, then we worked through institutions like the United Nations or NATO, or supported the European Union's development. And so it was conservative in the sense, more in the kind of Burkean sense, or maybe in the kind of theologian Reinhold Niebuhr sense of being concerned about overreach and the limits of the ability of the United States to remake the world in its own self-image. So I want to press you on the argument of what makes your piece distinctly conservative, and whether or not the conservative piece and the internationalist piece in your definition sit uneasily and at odds with each other. So start with that, and then we'll open it up to a round of questions.
No, it's a good point. But I think I certainly try very hard, maybe not convincingly, to try to show how thinking conservatively about politics at the domestic level does translate into foreign policy. That is, that one does want to think, one wants to avoid overreach. It's one of the reasons why, conservative internationalism will set priorities very clearly. They won't try to, they won't willy-nilly intervene in just about any situation you can find. It compromises and seeks only incremental changes, but changes that you can justify in terms of expanding the frontiers of freedom. So I think, now look, we've only thought about this in terms of liberal internationalism, or as you put it, establishment internationalism, up till this point in time. And liberals are more likely to think in terms of how, of deeper intervention and deeper sort of steps to kind of engineer, the institutions and the conditions of democracy abroad. Look, many neoconservatives were liberals, all right, who were prone to think in those terms. Now, I think conservatives, and that's what I've tried to sort of carve out here, is a section for thinking about this conservatively. Conservatives are not going to be tempted by that, by that approach, and they're going to be very clear about where it's important to intervene and where it's not important to intervene, and they're going to be looking constantly, as they do use leverage in the negotiations, they're going to be looking constantly for off-ramps, for ways that you can get an immediate compromise that can nevertheless improve the situation. I mean, for example, in Syria today, if we could get some negotiations going with an opposition group, a group of opposition parties at the table with Assad and the Russians and the Americans, that would be a step forward towards at least containing Assad. The one thing you don't want to do is let a situation develop in which, of course, eventually Assad eliminates the opposition forces, and there's no chance then of any chance of trying to sort of expand the options for freedom. But even in Syria, I repeat, that's a remote region. That's an area where I wouldn't put a lot of emphasis as conservative internationalist on spreading freedom. I would try to defeat the enemy, that is the threat, which in this case is ISIS, and defend the democracies that exist, certainly not do anything to hurt Israel, and otherwise be satisfied with that. Pay attention to what's going on in Ukraine. Pay attention to what's going on in Korea. I mean, you could argue in the last decade or decade and a half, we've done exactly the opposite. We've put an enormous amount of resources and effort into Iraq and Afghanistan, and basically we've ignored the major borders of freedom, giving Russia the opportunity that it seized. I'm not saying, the principal difference, I think, between conservative and liberal internationalism, in my mind, is not multilateralism. It is, that's a part of it, because the liberal internationalists will try to sort of work things through multilaterally if they can. But it's the unwillingness to use military leverage in negotiations. It's a desire to kind of keep force off the table until you can see whether or not negotiations can work. And I think that's, by the way, I think that's a very real difference. It's not black and white, all right, because there are many liberal internationalists who will be more willing, like Kerry, to apply leverage, military leverage, in the negotiation. But in general, I think it's a valid distinction, and it helps to kind of map the question of how do we approach a particular negotiation. At what point do you, do you use military leverage, and what kind of military leverage? So I think it's, in that sense, it helps. I'm not trying to, again, I'm not trying to invalidate another way of looking at the problem. I'm trying to carve out a fourth way of looking at it, if you want to put it in those terms.
All right, great beginning. I'm going to collect several questions and then I'll pose them to you, Henry. So, Josh.